Jerusalem. We're going to go out for a quick break right here on the Rundown, but don't miss this story coming up. From Hollywood to the Olympics, we've seen the last several months with an awakening about the scope of sexual harassment. We'll sit down with two men trying to change attitudes in one of the tightest communities in the world. Welcome back to the Rundown. And the last several months have seen no less than an awakening about the prevalence of sexual harassment and abuse of power across the board, from Hollywood to the Olympics. And one of the most important things really to come out of it has been a better understanding of just how hard it is for many to actually speak up, and the combination of factors that lead to silence in some cases for decades. And if that silence is so common in so-called liberal circles, just imagine what it's like in some of the most closed communities out there. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish community is one of them, and our two guests have both made it their mission to try and change how sexual abuse is dealt with there.
Joining us is Manny, founder and director of Kol Va'az, an organization that fights child sexual abuse in the Jewish community, and Rabbi Horowitz, founder and dean of Yeshiva Darchei Noam of Monsey, and author of a book on how to talk to kids about sexual abuse and to recognize it. Manny, I want to start with you because you have a personal story, a struggle that really has informed your activism on this issue. Could you briefly just give us that story?
Unfortunately, it's accurate. So I grew up in Australia as one of 17 children in a Chabad environment. My dad's Australian, my mum's Israeli. And growing up in the Yeshiva Center, which is under the Chabad leadership, and I was sexually abused there from the ages of around 11 years old till around 14 and a half. So it was over a 2-3 year period by two people who were very closely affiliated with the centre. One of them actually had a formal position at the centre, so people with especially as children, we'd look up to them, positions of authority. One used to read the Torah, and some of the abuse, the sexual abuse at that young age happened inside the synagogue itself, inside the male mikveh, where we used to bathe every day to purify ourselves, our souls. So certainly the abuse itself was something highly traumatic. That's an understatement. But the cover-ups subsequently by the institution, by the rabbis, by parents, by staff members, so many people, it turns out, were aware of the abuse that I endured for many years, and some of my other former classmates, schoolmates who also endured the same thing. And worse, in 2011, when I was the vice president of the Jewish community in Australia, I then finally decided, to speak publicly about the issue. And when I did, the entire Chabad community and leadership absolutely turned on me, not just in Australia, around the world. And sadly, they also had the support at that time of the broader Jewish community leadership, the mainstream. And part of the reason for that is because there was a lack of understanding, a lack of education, what you were referring about earlier, in the Jewish community. How does it happen? Do these good men really, are they capable of doing such crimes? And then when we hear about it, they covered it up and they intimidate. How can that be?
Manny, so how, within that context, difficult to imagine, how difficult, what a tight community, what a sort of cover-up, as you say, where did you find the courage and when to stand up and speak about?
Well, I went to the police at the age of 20. I'm now 41. And I had the doors essentially shut in my face because of lack of evidence, as so often is the case. So on the one hand, the police weren't able to do anything. On the other hand, when I went to the head rabbi there, and this went through a court process, so it's all been accepted as fact, that he was aware and he refused to deal with it. In fact, he told me straight out that we are dealing with it. There is no need for you to go elsewhere. It took another two decades almost for me to actually disclose it and to try to pursue justice in other ways. And at that time, it was really through utilising the media and disclosing the story publicly. And in all of this, I think the media plays a crucial role in terms of educating the community, raising awareness about this issue so we can all have a better understanding.
Rabbi Horowitz, you are living in a Monsey. Those that know it know that it is one of, I guess, those closed communities Norit is talking about. Tell us about your efforts to try to educate on this issue in that kind of community.
Right, so first of all, Manny's amazing, really an amazing person, a survivor and a very vocal advocate, good friend, pleasure to be on together. I've been in education for 35 years, in Jewish education, and it struck me about 15 years ago that a lot of the teens at risk that I was working with had been abused as children. And I also, kind of found it difficult to really get my hands around that people we know could do this. I began speaking out very publicly. Thankfully, I wasn't abused, but I certainly had firsthand information from dealing with so many survivors. And after about 5 years of advocacy, I stood with victims in a number of high-profile trials in the New York area. And then I started looking into, how do you stop this? How can you stop this from happening in the first place? And what emerged from speaking to experts, around the world and really trying to study as best I can, it's clear that educating children to understand the need for their personal space, the fact that they should be speaking to their parents regularly, nobody's allowed to tell them to keep a secret from parents, their bodies belong to them. Some touching is okay, some touching isn't okay.
I want to ask you, those principles are in a book, from what I understand, this book you have with us,
right,
that you are bringing to those communities.
That's
and to
correct.
some leaders of those ultra-Orthodox
Absolutely.
communities. How have they reacted when you show up on their doorstep and say, you need to start showing kids and parents this?
So Manny and I were just chatting outside. There really are two separate issues completely, and one is educating today's children, and the other is dealing with these horrible situations and supporting victims and changing the culture. I've been focused primarily in the last 10 years on getting the messages to parents. We wrote a book in English first. We published it in Yiddish. Some of the most Hasidic communities in America have purchased books. We're in over 50,000 homes in America. And now we just published them.
Let's hold them up so that people can see them.
So this is the book. Masha Batuach Batuach is the name, and this is primarily geared to the Chareidi community in Israel. So the pictures, depict life in Israel, furniture, everything.
How do those in the communities react to sort of receiving that book, or to your advocacy?
I met with senior leadership in the Dati Leumi world, world, and in the Chareidi world over the last few days, and I've got nothing but the absolute support, again, for this education piece.
Right.
I think the other piece is certainly much more complicated. But I've been in discussions over the last few days, and we really hope to get this into tens of thousands of homes.
All right, a very important conversation to be having. Gentlemen, stay with us. We're going to go out for a quick break. This conversation continues when we're back on The Rundown. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back, and we're discussing the issue of child sexual abuse in the Jewish community, especially the religious Jewish community. And with us are two people active in that issue, Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz and Manny Wax. And Manny, I would like you to talk a little bit about, we heard your story about your organization, Kol Va'oz, and what they do.
Sure. So Kol Va'oz means obviously voice and strength and courage, and it really focuses on the broader, high-level issues in the Jewish community, things that aren't being addressed. So, for example, in Israel, we have the law of return, and we have alleged perpetrators and convicted perpetrators either being encouraged or materially helped to come to Israel. And
to escape prosecution.
To escape prosecution, or in other cases is to escape their community, and they may have already paid for their crimes there, but they come to Israel and they now pose a danger to the local community here. We also deal with the issue of raising awareness and education in the community. Three-pronged approach. We focus on children, we focus on staff and volunteers of relevant institutions, and we focus on parents. And at the same time, we look at the prevention element that we spoke about. How do we prevent as much as we can? How do we detect intervention? Once we actually identify there may be a case, how do we deal with it? And lastly, how do we provide the support mechanisms that are required for victims, the direct victims themselves, as well as the secondary victims, family members, because the impact is very significant.
Yaakov, what are really the biggest challenges that you've come across when you're entering and trying to put new education, a new way of thinking in those very tightly guarded communities?
So just to support for a moment just Manny's point, I'm actually being sued by a sex offender here in Israel. I publicized, I sent a warning to parents in Jerusalem saying that a sex offender who escaped justice after offending again, I tweeted a warning to families, and he sued me for slander, and the case is going forward. It's almost 3 years already. We're supposed to go to trial in March. It just illustrates this whole thing with the Chok HaShvut, with the law of return. But I think parents need to, about speaking to their children, I think it's about relationship building. It's about getting in the habit of having your children speak to you every day, listening to them, letting them know that they can tell you anything. Those are the main things that are the components of a healthy, effective child safety education. There's great material online. There's great support material. And, you know, any parents that want to learn about it, I really encourage you to go online and discuss this. As for what you asked me about the, you know, the barriers, again, I have really been encouraged by the response to the education piece. And you know, we're going forward as best we can.
Manny, I want to ask you about the authorities. How have they responded to some of the issues you've raised, especially, as you said, people that are fleeing their own community, sex offenders that are fleeing prosecution or to resettle themselves and possibly carry on in Israel. With the government, what's your interaction been?
It's been generally very well received. I work closely with the Yoshevet Rosh, the chairperson of the Committee for the Rights of the Child in the Knesset, Yifat Shasha Biton from Kulanu. They take this issue very seriously, and I engage with them on a regular occasion. Now, also, over the last few years, what we have seen, and more recently in the context of the Me Too campaign, is much greater knowledge, awareness, understanding of the complexities and sensitivities around these issues, and therefore, there's greater willingness to address it. And therefore, we have seen in every segment of the Jewish community, and of course in broader society, the incredible progress we have made over the last few years, including and probably even especially in the ultra-Orthodox community, as we've seen with Rabbi Yanki saying that it's been a lot more welcome in his community, these education tools. At the same time, we also have a very long way to go, because our starting point, and again, in particular, the Chareidi world, was a lot lower than other segments of society. And therefore, we have a lot of catching up to do. And we need to take this issue seriously in terms of supporting those past victims, and there are countless of them, and also to prevent it, to make our children safer today.
Manny, just briefly, the fact that we're talking about a community that in many times is isolated from the internet, from social media, from even language classes like English, how big a role does that play in how easy it is to cover up this kind of sexual abuse?
Look, the more, what we've seen based on evidence, the more closed the community, the easier it is to get away with impunity. So there are increased vulnerabilities of children based on a number of factors. Close communities, large families, low socioeconomic according to some people as well. So there are a range of factors, and what we can do is to raise awareness and talk to them. Now, we need to try to work as close as we can with the rabbis and the leadership, and that is precisely what Kol Va'oz does.
All right, Manny Wax and Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz, incredible work that you do. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
That is it for us on The Rundown. We'll leave you with that important conversation. We'll be back here tomorrow, same time, same place, from our studios right here in the Jaffa Port.
Thanks for joining us. Catch The Rundown tomorrow.